Hey guys, in today's video I want to talk about things that tennis racket companies don't want you to know about because it goes against their best interest, which is to sell you a bunch of tennis rackets. And I'm going to start off by talking about the continuously improving tennis racket technology. I find this subject very fascinating. I've done videos in the past where I played with older rackets, and what I find interesting is whether my level will decrease and by how much it will decrease depending on how old the racket is that I'm playing with. So I made two videos where I played with wooden rackets, the all wood and double wood videos. Also made the tennis racket time machine video where I played with rackets from different decades, and it is so clear to see how much worse I'm playing with older technology. So yes, tennis racket technology has improved tremendously, but we have to be a little bit more specific when we talk about tennis racket technology. And the biggest improvement in tennis racket technology has been the introduction of graphite. Here I have the Dunlop Max 200G, which is a graphite racket, but if you take a look at the shape of this racket, this does not look like a modern racket at all. Very small racket head size. Compare that to the Michael Chang Prince long body racket. It looks completely different. This long body racket, it's almost 30 years old. It came out in 1995. This looks like a modern racket. Now, I'm not saying that the specs in the Michael Chang long body are the same specs that you will find in a modern racket. Not at all. Tennis racket technology continues to improve, but since the introduction of graphite, the improvements have been very gradual. And in fact, there are certain brands of rackets, certain models of rackets, certain molds, if you will, that have dominated the market, and many companies are copying off each other, so to speak. So there's only so much that you can do to that perfect mold that so many players like to play with, and there's simply not that much left to improve regarding tennis rackets. So for that reason, improvements in tennis racket technology are very small and very gradual, especially in recent times. But unfortunately, what happens with players is that they buy a racket that they like, and they maybe get a couple of them, and then 2 years later, a new model comes out, and not only has the design changed on the color, but the specs have been slightly tinkered with so that the new racket feels different from the previous version. And some players like this change and they adapt easily to the new model, but many other players are very frustrated by this, and the only thing they can do is stock up on the old model and buy as many of these rackets as possible so that they can use them for a long time. Because in fact, if you look at professional level players, they often play with the same model of racket for many years. Because the thing about tennis players is that we develop a feel and muscle memory for the racket, and making changes becomes very challenging. So what tennis racket companies don't want you to know about is that the technology improvements are very subtle and often insignificant to your game. Because remember that if we're talking about modern rackets, you making a change in the racket that you're playing with is going to be the smallest factor contributing to your tennis development. The biggest factors are going to be the repetitions that you're going to make and all that hard training. As long as we're talking about modern equipment and not playing with a wooden racket or a metal racket here, if you're playing with a modern racket and you're switching between models where the specs are a little bit different, will this make a change in your game? Sure, but it's going to be a very small percentage. And when we're talking about improving your technical flaws, improving your deficiencies, the racket's going to help you very little. Of course, we can get into maneuverability and all that, and that's a subject for another video. In my opinion, if the racket is more maneuverable, it's going to be easier for you to learn technique. But long story short, don't fall into the trap of new and improved technology, and it's perfectly fine for you to find the racket that you like and then stick with it for many years. In my opinion, you can play with the same racket for 5 years or longer. Now, how you're going to do that is going to be somewhat challenging. So the fact that you can play with the same racket possibly for a long time is something that tennis racket companies don't want you to know about. In fact, they don't want you to know that professional players are using old models of racket. They give them paint jobs, and it appears that professional level players are switching rackets every 2 years. And you know this to be true because back in the day, it used to be that on the various websites you would see this racket is used by so and so, and now it doesn't say that anymore because I think there was a lawsuit somewhere along the way, and now it says this racket is endorsed by such and such player. So everybody knows that professional players are not switching their rackets every 1 to 2 years. So the fact that you can play with the same racket for many, many years is something that tennis racket companies don't want you to know about. So how do you extend the lifespan of a tennis racket? Well, the obvious thing that you have to avoid is throwing your racket. You know, I've been seeing this video of Andy Roddick demonstrating how to throw a racket without breaking it, and 5 years ago I made a video on how to throw a racket without breaking it. I was very unsure whether to post this video on my YouTube channel because something about it didn't feel right, so I sent it to my dad to review it, and he told me, Nick, don't post this. This is not a good look. You don't want to be promoting throwing tennis rackets even though you're not breaking them. This is not a good thing. And I agreed, and I never posted this video. And then a couple of years ago, Andy Roddick came out with pretty much the same video. So not the most original idea in the world, how to throw a racket without breaking it, but I did make this video 5 years ago. And I'm happy that I never posted it, because don't throw your racket. I don't throw my rackets anymore for this specific reason. I want to extend the lifespan of my racket. So there are 3 things that you have to consider if you want to extend the lifespan of your racket. Factor number 1 is how frequently do you play. Factor number 2 is how hard do you play. And most importantly, factor number 3 is how often do you restring your racket. So let's talk about each factor. Let's say that you are an everyday player. You play 5 to 7 times per week. And let's say that you're not a hard player. What I mean by hard player is someone that scuffs the ground when they hit backhand slices, someone that scuffs the ground when they're retrieving shots, someone that is hard on their racket. If you take a close look here at this particular racket, my old Hyper Hammer, you can see that this racket is completely scuffed up. The frame has worn off. Why? Because on my backhand slice I sometimes touch the ground, and if you do this on a hard court, the racket will get eaten up real fast. So let's assume that this everyday player is easy on the racket. Let's assume that this everyday player is not a heavy string breaker. The racket could last up to 2 years before you see some signs of deterioration. Unfortunately, sometimes signs of deterioration are not always visible. So obviously when the racket is all scuffed up, you get a good feeling when it's time for a new one, but unfortunately the frame can also start playing differently. It can start deteriorating from the inside out. So obviously if you're someone who plays the racket hard and scuffs it up, this might possibly damage the frame even more, make it unstable, change the balance of the racket, and so on. If the frame starts getting shaved off or scuffed up, this is not a good thing. So if you have an everyday player who plays the racket very hard, that number of 2 years can be reduced to 1 year or less before you have to change the racket. Now, the most important factor regarding the lifespan of a tennis racket is how often you restring it, because when you hit a tennis ball, the pressure on the frame is distributed evenly. But when you restring a racket, the pressure is on just one small area of the racket. Now, for you guys that are familiar with string machines, you know that the racket is mounted with 4 spots usually. And there are some cheaper string machines that don't have the stabilization on the sides, and those string machines are very dangerous from the frame, because even if you have those 4 spots where the racket is tied down when the string is being pulled, you can still break the frame. The pressure is tremendous. Just think about if you string a racket at 50 pounds, for example, you're pulling 50 pounds on just one small area of the racket if you're doing one string at a time. In fact, I broke several rackets by accident. One time I was a stringer at a Challenger in Rockford, Illinois, and I broke this pro player's racket, and I felt very bad about it. But some rackets that have some weak spots in the frame might break during the stringing process. That's how much stress is put on the racket when it's being restrung. So obviously the more you restring your racket, the more you reduce the lifespan of a tennis racket. The modern strings that a lot of players are using don't break as much as they used to. See, when I grew up, I played with the old school monofilament polyester strings, and those used to break all the time. And if you play with synthetic gut or even multi-filament strings, you know that those strings break. Most copolyester strings, especially the low power dead ones, they're very stable strings that they don't break. I know recreational players that have had the same set of strings on their rackets for 2 years plus. So while this is great for the frame, this is possibly horrible for your arm, because you should restring your rackets frequently. The general rule of thumb is if you play once a week, you should restring your racket once a year. This heavily depends on what type of string that you're using. So some strings are going to be safe to use until they break or until they start deteriorating, because multi-filament, for example, will start fraying, and if you see that the string is deteriorating, you know it's time to get it restrung. And synthetic gut is such a fragile string that it will break even at the recreational level. You don't have to worry about that so much. Now, when it comes to polyester strings, they don't fray, but there's an easy test that you can perform. So if you pull down the cross strings, you're going to feel a gap in the main strings. And if that gap is super deep, that's a good sign that it might be time to restring your racket. If that gap in your string is not that deep, you're safe to keep playing with that poly strings for a while longer. So my advice is that you don't go with the general rule of thumb, because that applies more to the old-fashioned strings, and that rule of thumb has been around for ages. For the modern strings that now are used even at the recreational level, the polyester strings, the copolyester strings, if you play once a week, you should restring your racket twice a year, so every 6 months. If you play 2 times per week or more, you increase that and you get your racket restrung every 3 months. You want to ensure that especially a copolyester string that's in your racket is not dead, because that can transfer into your arm and you can start seeing problems. Now, of course, what I'm saying now goes against the lifespan of a racket, because the more frequently you restring your racket, the more you reduce the racket's lifespan. But there's one trick that I want to share with you that can increase the lifespan of the racket. So what I see from a lot of players is the following. They have 2 or 3 of the same racket, and they play with the same one while the other 2 are sitting in their bag fresh. So this is not something that you want to do, because not only are you unevenly using up the frames and killing one racket while the other ones are still intact, which means that you once had 3 rackets, soon you're only going to have 2. You also are going to have a situation where the rackets are going to play differently. So let's say that you have a favorite racket that you play with out of the 3 that are exactly the same, and now you pop a string and you go to the one that's barely been used. That one is going to feel completely different, because remember, the racket frame, even though there's no visible signs of aging on the racket, the frame is still aging as long as you keep playing with the racket and you keep restringing it. So that brand new one will feel different. So what you have to do is the following. If you have multiple rackets, you have to number the rackets. So let's say you have 3 rackets. You're going to put a little sticker on the inside here with the number 1. You're going to take your second racket, you're going to put a little sticker with the number 2 on that one, and you're going to put a sticker on the third racket. And on Monday, you're going to play with racket number 1. On Tuesday, you're going to play with racket number 2. On Wednesday, you're going to play with racket number 3. On Thursday, you're going to go back to racket number 1. And this is a phenomenal way to increase the lifespan of your racket. But it's not only that, now all 3 rackets that you have are going to play the same. Now, if you watch my recent lesson with Shamir, where I was advising him to string looser, I also told him to have 2 different tensions in his bag with a discrepancy of up to 5 pounds. And what I'm saying now goes completely against what I told Shamir. So one solution to this contradiction is to possibly string all rackets that you have the same in practice if you're going to swap from one to the other. But then when it comes to match time, where you want to maximize your chances of winning and you don't want to leave anything up to chances, is there where you increase the discrepancy between the tensions, and you want to have a racket that's a little bit looser and one that's a little bit tighter in case you need one or the other when it comes to match time. And last but not least, and this is of course going to depend on your financial situations, but the more of the same kind of rackets that you can buy, the better. And there are great websites out there like eBay where you can buy discontinued models, because you know that discontinued rackets are hard to purchase. They're hard to come by. So you should stock up on your perfect racket and get as many of them as possible. You don't ever have to worry about rackets again, especially if you follow the advice in this video, which is to never throw your racket and to number your rackets so that all of them get used up evenly.